October 17th, 11:42 p.m. A kitchen light hums softly over a half-empty glass of water. The house is quiet now, everyone has gone home. He stands at the sink staring at his reflection in the dark window. The laughter from earlier still lingers in the walls, but it feels distant, like it belonged to someone else. The evening had been full, conversations overlapping, shoulders brushing, familiar faces, yet somewhere between the small talk and the polite smiles something inside him began to withdraw. You can almost feel it, that subtle internal shift, not dramatic, not bitter, just a quiet stepping back. He dried his hands slowly. The room was warm, but he felt exposed, as if the air itself had noticed what he had been pretending not to see. He doesn't hate them, that's the strange part. There is no resentment, no betrayal, just a growing awareness that something no longer fits. Earlier that night, when Daniel from accounting had slapped him on the back and said, "You're too quiet, man, you need to loosen up," everyone laughed, including him. But something in his chest tightened. Not because Daniel was cruel, it was harmless, casual, the kind of remark that evaporates seconds after it's spoken. Yet it didn't evaporate. It lingered. Because beneath the joke was an expectation: be more, speak louder, blend in, smooth out the edges, become digestible. He has spent years doing exactly that. In high school, he learned how to laugh at jokes he didn't find funny. In college, he mastered the art of being agreeable. At work, he studied the unspoken rules of likability: don't go too deep, don't stay silent too long, don't ask the questions that make people uncomfortable. Belonging, he thought, meant adaptation. And adaptation works for a while. But the psyche keeps score. Carl Jung once described the human personality as containing both a social mask and a deeper self that remains hidden beneath it. Over time, if the mask grows too rigid, too permanent, something inside begins to suffocate. Tonight, suffocation felt like silence. When the group moved to lighter topics, vacations, promotions, who bought what car, he felt himself drifting, not physically, internally. Their voices sounded further away, the jokes louder, the pauses more artificial. He tried to re-enter the rhythm, he really did. He added a comment, forced a grin. But it felt like trying to speak through glass. And in that moment, small, invisible to everyone else, he realized something unsettling. He no longer wanted to try that hard. Not because he felt superior, not because he felt rejected, but because something within him had matured. Psychologically, growth is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It often arrives disguised as discomfort. The old environment begins to feel cramped. Conversations once energizing now drain you. The music gets louder, but your interest gets quieter. And here's the part no one prepares you for. Loneliness can feel like alignment. Standing in that kitchen, he sensed it. A strange dignity in the emptiness. The evening hadn't gone wrong, nothing exploded, no conflict erupted. But something had ended. The version of him that needed to be included at any cost was dissolving. You can almost hear the internal dialogue beginning. What's wrong with me? Why can't I just enjoy this? Why do I always feel different? Those questions are not signs of social failure. They are signs of individuation. Individuation, the Jungian term for the psyche's movement toward wholeness, requires separation. It demands that the self step back from collective expectations and ask a dangerous question: who am I when I stop performing? Most people avoid that question because the answer costs something. It costs invitations, it costs approval, it sometimes costs proximity. And the ego interprets that cost as rejection. But rejection and misalignment are not the same. He wasn't being pushed out. He was quietly outgrowing. There's a difference. When you are rejected, you fight to return. When you outgrow, you feel sorrow but not panic. That's what he felt now, not panic, just a gentle grief, like realizing a childhood home no longer fits your adult body. He walked into the living room, the cushions still indented from where everyone had sat. Empty glasses on the coffee table, a faint scent of cologne in the air. He imagined hosting another night like this next month, and instead of excitement, he felt fatigue. That's when it became undeniable. Belonging everywhere was never sustainable. The psyche cannot thrive in constant self-editing. At some point, the energy required to maintain universal lickability becomes heavier than solitude. He turned off the kitchen light, the room fell into shadow, and in the darkness, something inside him felt clearer. You were never meant to belong everywhere. Nature doesn't design roots to spread into every soil. Some roots wither in the wrong ground not because they're weak but because they require different minerals. Selective belonging is not arrogance, it's ecology. And yet the mind resists this truth. Because belonging feels like survival. From childhood, we learn that inclusion equals safety. The nervous system equates acceptance with protection, so when environments begin to feel misaligned, the body reads it as danger. But what if the danger is staying? What if the quiet ache you feel in certain rooms is not social anxiety, but psychological evolution? Standing in the dim hallway, he felt the weight of that possibility. If he stopped trying to fit, who would remain? Would anyone call? Would anyone notice? This is the threshold moment, the fragile space between conformity and authenticity. And most people turn back here. They re-enter the group, they adjust their tone, they shrink their questions, they convince themselves that depth is overrated. Because solitude is terrifying. But there is another possibility. That this loneliness is not exile. That it is initiation. He glanced at his phone, no new notifications, no lingering messages from the evening. Just silence. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel like punishment. It felt like a doorway. And he hadn't decided yet whether to walk through it. The hallway remains dark, only the faint blue glow of his phone screen cuts through the silence. 11:58 p.m. He doesn't scroll, he just watches the light fade as the screen times out. In the quiet, something unfamiliar settles in his chest. Not dread, not relief, something more precise. Clarity. The next morning arrives without drama. Alarm, shower, coffee, commute, the world looks unchanged, but internally a subtle fracture line has appeared. At 9:07 a.m. he sits in the Monday briefing. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, chairs scrape, laptops open in synchronized ritual. Daniel is already mid-sentence narrating weekend exploits with theatrical exaggeration. The room laughs on cue. He observes. Not critically, just observantly. You can almost feel the distance widening not physically but psychologically. The conversation sounds like it's happening through a pane of glass. Words move but they don't penetrate. This is how outgrowing begins. Not with rebellion. With detachment. He notices how often he edits himself before speaking. How quickly he converts genuine thoughts into socially acceptable fragments. A question forms in his mind about the long-term vision of the company, about meaning, sustainability, depth. But when his turn comes, he hears himself say something safe about quarterly targets. The mask is efficient. It knows how to survive. Jung described the persona as a necessary interface between the individual and society. Without it, we would be raw nerve endings, overwhelmed and overwhelming. But the danger comes when the persona becomes identity. When the role replaces the self. And that realization begins to sting. At 12:42 p.m., he declines the lunch invitation. Got some stuff to finish up, he says lightly. They shrug, no one interrogates the excuse, the world continues spinning. He walks instead. Outside, the October air carries a quiet crispness, leaves scrape against pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wails briefly before dissolving into traffic noise. Alone, he notices how his shoulders drop. It's subtle but measurable. Solitude is not always emptiness, sometimes it is decompression. For years, he mistook overstimulation for connection. The crowded tables, the constant chatter, the feeling of being surrounded, but surrounded does not mean seen. And seen does not mean understood. As he turns down a quieter street, he recalls something from childhood, 3rd grade, recess. He used to wander to the edge of the playground where the fence met a row of trees. While other kids negotiated games and hierarchies, he would watch ants navigate cracks in the sidewalk. Teachers called him shy. But he wasn't shy. He was observing. There is a difference between social fear and selective engagement. Some souls are not built for constant immersion in the collective, They require intervals of silence to metabolize experience. Depth demands digestion. But the world rarely rewards that. The world rewards visibility. Back at his desk, he feels the pull of conformity again: Slack notifications, calendar reminders, the low-grade anxiety of staying relevant. Relevance, that's the word. Belonging everywhere often masquerades as relevance. If you are included in every circle, invited to every gathering, tagged in every thread, you feel necessary. But necessary to what? A role, a function, or to your own unfolding. By late afternoon, fatigue settles in, not from workload but from performance. The subtle tension of calibrating tone, volume, facial expression, the microadjustments of personality. It is exhausting to be universally palatable. And something in him no longer wants to be. This is the shedding phase. It doesn't look heroic. There are no dramatic exits, no speeches, just small refusals. He stops laughing at jokes that don't resonate. He allows silence to linger instead of rushing to fill it. He answers questions honestly, even if the answer creates pause. And the room begins to respond. Not with hostility, with confusion. "Everything okay?" someone asks midweek. "Yeah," he says calmly. And he means it. But what they're sensing is difference, a deviation from his established pattern. The agreeable version of him is softening. In its place is something quieter, less eager. This is where loneliness sharpens. Because as you shed false belonging, invitations subtly decrease. The energy shifts. You're still included, but with less enthusiasm. Conversations skim past you more quickly. It would be easy to panic here, to overcorrect, to host another dinner, crack louder jokes, send extra messages, reassert your social presence. But he doesn't. Instead, he watches. He notices who reaches out without performance required, who tolerates his silences, who asks deeper questions instead of surface ones. The circle grows smaller, but the air grows cleaner. One evening, Daniel texts, "You've been kinda distant lately, everything cool?" He stares at the message longer than necessary. What is the truthful response? He could apologize, blame stress, promise to get back to normal. But normal no longer fits. He types slowly, "Yeah, just rethinking some things, needed a little space." The three dots appear, disappear, reappear. "Gotcha," Daniel replies, "don't disappear on us." On us. The phrasing is gentle, but it reveals something important. Belonging often comes with an unspoken contract. Stay consistent, stay recognizable, don't evolve too abruptly. Growth disrupts predictability. And predictability makes people comfortable. As the weeks pass, the silence between messages lengthens, not dramatically, just gradually, like a tide pulling back millimeter by millimeter. He feels the ache of it. Let's not romanticize this part. Selective belonging hurts. There are Friday nights when the apartment feels too quiet, when he wonders if he miscalculated, when he scrolls through photos of group outings and feels a flicker of exclusion. The old survival instinct whispers, "Go back. Blend in. Be easy." But something steadier whispers back, "Wait." Because beneath the loneliness is something new forming. An internal center of gravity. Without constant external mirroring, he begins to ask different questions. What do I actually enjoy? What conversations nourish me? What pace feels natural to my nervous system? These questions were drowned out before. Now they echo clearly. He starts reading more, not for productivity, for curiosity. He journals without agenda. He spends entire Saturdays without speaking to anyone and notices not emptiness, but restoration. The psyche, when given space, reorganizes. And in that reorganization, old attachments loosen. One afternoon, weeks later, he runs into a former colleague at a cafe. They exchange pleasantries. The colleague says, "We miss you at the happy hours, you were always the glue." Glue. He smiles politely, but internally something clicks. Glue holds things together. But glue has no shape of its own. He walked home that evening with a strange mix of grief and relief. He was no longer interested in being adhesive. He wanted to be solid. And solidity doesn't bond with every surface. It selects. That night, sitting again in the dim kitchen, he feels the loneliness return, but it feels different now, less like absence, more like space being cleared. Because something unexpected has begun to happen. In the quiet, a new desire is emerging. Not to belong everywhere, but to belong truthfully. And he's about to discover what that really costs. November 9th, 6:18 a.m. The city is still blue with early light. Steam rises from his coffee in slow spirals. The apartment is silent except for the distant hum of traffic below. He stands by the window, watching one man jog across an empty intersection, breath visible in the cold. There's a strange steadiness in him now, not happiness, not sadness. Steadiness. But steadiness comes with a price. 2 weeks after that cafe encounter, the shift becomes visible. The group chat goes quiet, not entirely, but the tone changes. Memes fly back and forth, inside jokes evolve without him. He reads them hours later, sometimes days. He no longer feels compelled to respond instantly. And that non-response speaks. Belonging everywhere requires constant maintenance. Replies, reactions, participation. It is an ecosystem of reinforcement. When you step back even slightly, the ecosystem recalibrates. You can almost feel the recalibration happening in real time. One Friday evening, he's home reading when his phone buzzes. Drinks at Harper's You in. He pauses. Old instinct say yes, show up, stay visible. New instinct, ask yourself if you actually want to be there. He closes his eyes for a moment, imagines the dim bar, the loud music, the half-yelled conversations, the ritual complaints about work, the predictable rhythm. His chest tightens slightly, not with anxiety but with resistance. He types "not tonight, appreciate the invite." He sets the phone down. And then comes the wave. A sudden surge of aloneness that hits like cold water. The apartment feels too still, the clock too loud, doubt creeps in like fog. What if you're isolating yourself? What if this is pride disguised as growth? What if you're simply becoming difficult? These are not trivial questions. The psyche tests every transition. Growth without self-examination becomes arrogance. But he sits with the discomfort instead of reacting to it. This is new. In the past, he would have rushed to soothe the anxiety by rejoining the group. Tonight, he lets the loneliness crest and fall like a wave. He notices something subtle beneath it. The loneliness isn't screaming. It's whispering. And what it whispers is this: you are withdrawing from noise, not from people. There's a difference. Later that night, he takes a walk. The air is colder now. Streetlights cast long amber shadows across the pavement. He passes couples in restaurant windows, laughter behind glass. He feels the pang again. Humans are tribal, we are wired for connection. Even the most introspective among us carry an ancient imprint that says, alone equals vulnerable. But psychological solitude is not the same as social exile. As he walks, he recalls something from Jung's framework, the idea that the psyche contains both conscious identity and an unconscious reservoir of neglected parts. If you spend too long performing a socially acceptable role, those neglected parts gather in shadow. And the shadow does not disappear. It waits. For years, he avoided certain conversations because they felt too intense, avoided certain opinions because they might disrupt harmony, avoided expressing certain doubts because they would complicate dynamics. Where do those avoided pieces go? They sink into the shadow, and eventually they demand integration. Selective belonging is not about rejecting others. It's about making room for your shadow to surface without fear of expulsion. A few days later, something small but significant happens. During a team meeting, a strategic decision is being rushed through. Normally, he would nod along, contribute a neutral comment, keep the waters calm. Instead, he clears his throat. "I'm not sure we've thought through the long-term impact of this," he says evenly. The room pauses. Not hostile, just surprised. He continues, measured, thoughtful, not combative. He asks deeper questions, points out risks others glossed over. There's a slight tension in the air, someone shifts in their chair. But he doesn't retract. For the first time, he feels what it's like to occupy space without apology. Afterward, a colleague pulls him aside. "Didn't expect that from you," she says. He almost asks what she means. But he knows. She means, I didn't expect you to disrupt the equilibrium. He walks back to his desk with a pulse of adrenaline in his veins. Not because he was confrontational. Because he was congruent. Congruence is intoxicating. When your external behavior matches your internal reality, the nervous system relaxes in a way it never could while performing. That evening he doesn't feel drained. He feels grounded. But the cost continues to surface in subtle ways. Invitations become less frequent, casual interactions lose warmth, the glue roll dissolves fully. He's no longer the bridge builder, the easy mediator, the socially adaptable one. And with that dissolution comes identity grief. If you're not the connector, who are you? If you're not the agreeable one, what remains? This is the dangerous middle phase of individuation. You have shed the old skin, but the new skin hasn't fully formed. And in that in-between, loneliness sharpens again. There are evenings where he sits with journal open, pen hovering, unsure what version of himself is emerging. He writes questions instead of answers. What do I believe when no one is watching? What parts of me did I suppress to stay liked? What conversations would I initiate if I wasn't afraid of being too much? Too much. That phrase echoes. For years, he minimized his intensity, his depth, his tendency to dissect meaning from casual remarks. He learned that not everyone wants to explore the undercurrents of life at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. So he flattened himself. Now the flattening is revering. And as it reverses, he feels both expansion and exposure. One Sunday afternoon, he receives a message from someone he hasn't spoken to in months, Maya, an old acquaintance known for long philosophical conversations. Random question, she texts, do you ever feel like you're not meant to fit into most spaces? He stares at the screen. The timing feels uncanny. They meet at a quiet bookstore cafe later that week. Their conversation flows without effort, no need to perform, no need to dilute. They speak about identity, about solitude, about the strange ache of outgrowing social environments without animosity. He notices something profound. The loneliness that once felt like absence now feels like filtration. As he walks home from that cafe, he realizes something irreversible. Selective belonging doesn't shrink your world. It refines it. But refinement is ruthless. You lose volume. You gain resonance. And as winter approaches, another realization begins to surface, one that will force him to confront a deeper fear. If you stop belonging everywhere, where exactly do you belong? December 2nd, 9:36 p.m. Snow begins to fall outside his apartment window, slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The city softens under it, sound dampens, headlights blur into halos, even the usual Friday night restlessness seems muted. He stands with his hands in his pockets, watching the flakes collect along the fire escape railing. There is something about the first real snowfall of winter that feels like permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to narrow. Inside, the apartment is warm. A lamp glows in the corner beside a stack of books, dog-eared, underlined, lived in. His phone rests face down on the table, silent. He doesn't feel the urge to flip it over. That alone tells you something has shifted. Months ago, silence meant invisibility. Now it feels like incubation. Earlier that evening, the group chat had lit up again, holiday party plans, coordinated outfits, bar reservations, a poll about Secret Santa. He read through the thread carefully, noticing something unexpected. No resentment. No longing. Just neutrality. And beneath the neutrality, a quiet certainty. He would not be there. Not as protest, not as punishment, simply because the space no longer felt aligned with who he was becoming. This is the sacred narrowing. The phase where your social world contracts, but your inner world expands. Jung believed that as we mature psychologically, we are drawn toward wholeness, not popularity. And wholeness often requires differentiation. You cannot individuate while constantly merging with the collective mood. Snow continues to fall outside, covering sidewalks that earlier held hurried footsteps. The city looks almost monastic now. He sits at the table and opens his journal. Instead of asking who he belongs to, he writes, "What do I want my life to feel like?" The question is different. Belonging everywhere had been about distribution, spreading himself thin enough to remain included across contexts, but this question centers around texture. Feeling. He writes slowly. I want conversations that don't require translation. I want friendships that tolerate silence. I want work that doesn't demand fragmentation. I want space to think. The words look almost simple on paper, but they represent a radical departure from his old operating system. Because once you admit what you truly want, you can no longer pretend satisfaction with less. There's a cost to clarity. Selective belonging means you will not be everyone's first call, you will not be universally understood. Some will misinterpret your quiet as distance, your boundaries as aloofness. And you will have to let them. A week later, that cost materializes more sharply. At the office holiday gathering, he does show up briefly, out of courtesy. The room is loud, pulsing with music and alcohol-fueled camaraderie. Decorations hang from the ceiling in exaggerated cheer. Daniel spots him immediately. There he is, thought you'd ghost us. The tone is playful, but there's an edge beneath it. He smiles, relaxed, just keeping a lower profile these days. Don't get too enlightened on us, someone jokes from behind a drink. Laughter ripples outward. You can feel the subtle friction. Growth unsettles those who remain in familiar patterns not because they dislike you but because your shift highlights their stagnation. He stays for an hour, engages lightly, doesn't overextend. When he leaves, no dramatic exit occurs, just a nod, a few goodbyes. Walking into the cold night air feels like surfacing from underwater. His breath fogs in front of him, snow crunches underfoot, and for the first time he notices something profound. He no longer feels torn between two selves. There is no social mask to peel off. There is just him. That integration is subtle but powerful. Over the following weeks, his circle becomes unmistakably smaller. Maya remains. A coworker named Elias, quiet, observant, begins joining him for occasional lunch walks. Their conversations are sparse but meaningful, no forced enthusiasm, no role-playing. He realizes something crucial. Selective belonging doesn't eliminate connection. It magnetizes resonance. When you stop broadcasting yourself indiscriminately, you become more visible to those attuned to your frequency. But there is still one lingering fear. What if this narrowing continues? What if the circle becomes so refined that only one or two people remain? Are you prepared for that? This is where many retreat. They re-expand artificially, fearing isolation. But he experiments with trust. On a snowy Sunday afternoon, he turns down yet another large gathering and instead spends hours reorganizing his space. Clearing shelves, donating old clothes, removing objects tied to past identities. The external decluttering mirrors the internal one. Belonging everywhere had cluttered him with expectations, with roles, with micro-adaptations. Now, as he stands in the center of a simplified room, he feels something rare. Coherence. Not excitement. Not euphoria. Coherence. And coherence feels like power, not the loud kind but the grounded kind. Weeks later, sitting across from Maya at the cafe again, she says something that lands deeply. It feels like you've gotten quieter, she observes, but also more present. He considers that. Quieter, yes. Because he no longer competes for space. More present, yes. Because he's no longer split between who he is and who he thinks he should be. That split, that internal fracture is what made belonging everywhere so exhausting. The constant calculation, how much of me is safe here? Now the calculation is simpler. Is this space aligned? If yes, he enters fully. If no, he withdraws without hostility. This is the dignity of selective belonging. But here, the final revelation he begins to grasp as the year closes. You were never meant to belong everywhere, because belonging everywhere prevents you from belonging deeply anywhere. Depth requires commitment. And commitment requires exclusion. On New Year's Eve, instead of attending 3 overlapping parties as he once would have, he chooses one quiet dinner with Maya and Elias, just 3 people, candles, slow conversation, no performance. At midnight, as fireworks erupt faintly in the distance, he doesn't feel like he's missing out. He feels anchored. And in that anchoring, a realization crystallizes. Loneliness was never the enemy. Fragmentation was. He steps outside briefly after midnight. The air is sharp, winter clean, fireworks flicker above rooftops, the city celebrates loudly. But inside him, the celebration is silent. He understands now. Belonging is not about quantity. It is about congruence. It is about choosing environments where your nervous system does not have to brace. And that choice will always narrow your world. But it will also deepen it. He looks up at the sky bright with scattered light and feels something that once terrified him. Alone, but not lonely. Selective, and finally aligned.